in any event, I spent a few weeks at the Battle of El Alamein, and chapter 1 of my book is actually which you should read, and I won't go into, records a telephone conversation I received in Cairo after the Battle of El Alamein. I'm now in British Special. I was recruited into British Special Operations for the Balkans, for Albania. I became intelligence officer for Albania, supporting the resistance in Albania to the Nazi or German occupation. But I did have an incredible phone call in December 1942 in Cairo from FDR that you must read because it's quite a story. But bottom line is that FDR did not take my advice and screwed up. But I, of course, as a leftist, I did have admiration, much more admiration for FDR than I did. I had no admiration for Churchill because Churchill represented the British class system, British imperialism, everything I was really opposed to. I admired and respected Eisenhower very much, and certain other American generals, but not particularly Patton. We didn't. It's hard to describe how allies and enemies sort of look. Fighting troops are fairly objective in their way. We never trusted Montgomery. He was a showman, clearly doing Churchill's kind of propaganda. Churchill was booed in the streets of Cairo. I observed at the so-called Cairo conference that I attended in October, November 1942. Churchill was actually booed by British troops Churchill's in an open vehicle parading through the streets of Cairo, booed by the British. The one whom we Brits admired very much was Rommel. He was professionally pretty good. This is now back to the Alamein days, listening to German radio playing Lili Marlene, which was our favorite World War II song, German song. So it's hard to describe. Nothing like this Walter Cronkite, Greatest Generation bullshit. We were all more or less citizen soldiers doing our job. Most of us had been conscripted and wanted to we wanted to finish the job as fast as possible. The book goes from actually my birth in 1920. It goes to 1946 when I'm after 6 years in the British, essentially British intelligence, because I married, my first wife was in OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was the American equivalent of what I was in, Special Operations Executive. I was a GI bridegroom, got a free trip. There is a final chapter the book is called A Different Kind of War. And I did attain the rank of major, which was in the British Army quite a relatively high rank. We figured that our ranks were one step higher than the equivalent American ranks. I did, for the last chapter in the book, I was obsessed by German underground, German resistance to Hitler, both before and during World War II, which I felt had been ignored or downplayed by both Churchill and Roosevelt. Roosevelt insisted on unconditional, at the Casablanca conference in 1943, insisted on unconditional surrender.
Yeah, famous.
Famously. But British were, he really twisted Churchill's arm on that. But of course, by that time, America is really calling the shots. Washington, not London. British power was declining, American power was blossoming, enormous, and American economy in particular. So, fast forward, and I had a series of different careers in Boston, New York.
And again, you made it over here because of marriage.
Yes, I stayed.
Your wife was from...
I didn't want to go back to England because after 6 years, I had kind of lost touch. The British are nowhere near as generous to their veterans as the Americans were and are. So I didn't... And I hadn't really lived that much in England when you consider I'd been to university in Paris and Vienna. Yes, a couple of years at London University, but I had no desire really then or now to go back to Britain. I'd much rather live in France if I lived in Europe, but that's a separate story. I remained obsessed with the idea, unresolved question in my mind about German resistance within Germany to Hitler and the Nazis. And in 1962, I'm planning, after a series of careers in medical science writing, I was blacklisted at Columbia University, by the way, for outing the CIA on a radio, People's Platform radio program.
Outing them, the existence of?
Yeah.
You mean the existence of?
I revealed the existence of the CIA was recruiting on the, because in 1949, I applied to Columbia University, had a Russian institute, and I had taught myself Russian after working with the Russians in Italy, dropping supplies to the communist partisans in Albania and Yugoslavia. I did weekend photography. I was a medical science writer, editor of Worldwide Medical News, all in New York. I was managing editor of Worldwide Medical News Service in New York, and I got into international marketing. But I was doing weekend photography, and I had very great encouragement from two Hungarian photographers, one of whom lived in the same building as me, Nicholas Murai, who was a famous portraitist, and who introduced me to Andrei Kertész, who became my mentor. We're now 1960, 59, 60. With their encouragement, and I decided to become a full-time professional. But I wanted to save enough money to live for 1 year
Right.
without depending on my income. And so I applied for and got a 1-year contract with an American, German, French, Swedish cosmetic company in Munich as their general manager.
Right.
And in November 1962, I think, I go to Paris to be trained by this company. Hold on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've seen that one. Yep.
And in the first weekend in November 1962, at the famous Continental Hotel, old-fashioned, wonderful old hotel in Munich, I take the train about 25 kilometers to Dachau,
Mm-hmm.
which is the first Nazi concentration camp. And I won't go into that story because I've also written that.
Your mother,
But
because of your mother's
I was
side of the
impressed
family.
by the fact that the Germans were using the Dachau concentration camp as an educational museum,
Oh, I see.
where the day I was there, several groups of teachers were teaching young German teenagers about the horrors of the
Sure.
concentration camps and the Holocaust.
Hmm.
As I was leaving, and I do have documented that I was very impressed that Germany, unlike Austria, unlike France, was coming to grips
Mm-hmm.
much more closely than those two countries with the facts of the Nazi era and the Nazi horror.
Sure.
As I was leaving in a snowy November afternoon, I took one parting farewell shot of Dachau, and this is quite a famous Jon Naar photograph.
It's amazing.
In effect, one of the first I published in Germany. This is a preface to saying that living for 1 year, speaking German pretty much all day long in my job as general manager of this cosmetic company, traveling all over Germany, I was obsessed with the fact, and I asked Germans outright, how could you have lived within 25 kilometers of Dachau and not known what those trains were taking in, what that black smoke was coming out of chimneys? The young people said, yes, my father was a Nazi, but what are you doing about the Vietnam War? The older ones of my generation, half of them said, well, most of the men said, look, yes, we knew what was happening, but we faced torture and imprisonment, torture and death from the Gestapo if we resisted. Yes, I should have spoken up. Or my brother did speak up, and he was arrested and guillotined by the Gestapo. So and other Germans did, but few of them actually denied it because it was so evident. We're talking 1962, 1963.
Zeitgeist.
Yes. I happened to be yesterday, Sunday, September, whatever else, 28, at the Museum of the New Jersey State Museum. They had an interesting program on social change through art, and I described the incredible impact that I have had from this photograph, which doesn't show the horrors of the death camp or the torture or the ovens and so on. And yet somehow in not only Germans but in other people, it does somehow evoke a whole kind of, as you said, zeitgeist, and people can relate to that. And, I've been published not only in 12 books, but in a lot of magazines and ads and so on, as you know. But this photograph is one of my most, I can consider it one of my most important. The interesting thing is that the first assignment, of course, here I am, 43 years old, on January 1, 1963, my contract with the cosmetic company ended. I had saved the money, I'd lived on my expense account. I took off my Brooks Brothers suit, tie, shirt and tie, put on a turtleneck sweater, corduroy trousers, and a leather jacket, and actually got myself, and I would say in German to potential clients, ich bin Jon Naar, ein Fotograf aus New York. I am Jon Naar, a photographer from New York. Well, I wasn't a New York then photographer,
Sure.
but I was Jon Naar, a photographer, from New York. And I got myself an assignment from an Italian magazine called Domus, an Italian design magazine. I phoned up the editor in Milano, Lisa Ponti, editor-publisher, I got her name, and I proposed a reportage on what in German was called Die verlorene Generation, the lost generation, which was my counterpart generation in Germany, because I was curious what had happened to the Germans of my age.
I see. Okay.
I'd had my own problems, as I described earlier, pacifism versus being an anti-fascist, which, I didn't resolve too heroically, in fact. And so, anyhow, the Italian publisher, Lisa Ponte, she liked the idea. This is by telephone from Munich, and I think we spoke French. I do speak Italian because I had lived in Italy for 2 years with Special Operations Albania as their intelligence officer across the Adriatic from Bari by parachute and by boat into Albania to work mostly with the partisans. A chapter on that you can read. So in any event, the Italian publisher says, yes, I like your idea, and if you come up with some good pictures, I'll give you 16 pages. And I said, if I come up with nothing because of this lost generation, would you be brave enough to publish 16 pages of nothing? And she laughed, and in any event, I did go all around Germany, and of course in those days we had West and East Germany, and I ended up with a pretty good reportage. and she Domus gave me 20, not 16, but 23 pages. So it was a tremendous kickoff, if you would like. But at age now 44, I'm not really willing to climb the ladder from the bottom. I decided I'd go for the big time, and I did another blockbuster of an assignment for 2 German magazines. July 20, 1964 was the 20th anniversary of the plot, the so-called von Stauffenberg plot to assassinate Hitler.
Okay.
And I have a very...
Interesting.
That's this final chapter 10 of A Different Kind of War, where I interview the survivors. My idea was to do a story 20 years later to find survivors, both what I call the good guys and the bad guys. What would you have done differently? How do you feel about, assassination today under those circumstances? So I got a pretty good story in a popular German magazine. Actually, they did not one but 2 following week issues on it. It was called, the magazine called Die Neue Illustrierte, and I kept the copyright, and I sold the story to Look magazine back here in New York, and they did a cover story on the men who tried to kill Hitler. So I'm building a pretty good portfolio.
Right, but this is just not photos. This is also the article.
Well, I did.
I
recruited from London a German writer called Heinrich Frenkel, who had just written a book called, fortuitously, The Men Who Tried to Kill Hitler.
Okay.
So I got Frenkel to come to Germany. I think we met in Düsseldorf. And he and I traveled 5,000 kilometers in 10 days in the classic Porsche, me in the rumble seat around West and East Germany, interviewing and photographing, tracking down survivors and interviewing. Berlin, Hamburg, East Germany, so on. So that was also a pretty good story. So by the time I'm back in New York, because my son, one and only son, is born June 29, 1964, I figured I actually missed his birth at Mount Sinai because he was 6 weeks premature. I now become Jon Naar, New York
photographer.
Without New York photographer.
No comma.
No comment. No comment.
No.
And in just to fast forward, actually almost 10 years, and I'm based now in a wonderful studio duplex apartment, 230 East 50th in Midtown Manhattan. New York Times Magazine, Fortune, IBM, quite a wide range of clients, including
Knoll
yes,
International.
Did a lot of work for Knoll. In 1972, and I'm working for French and German Italian magazines and clients. A very good client in London called Pentagram. I was doing annual reports and ads for Reuters and other clients of theirs. And I get a phone call from one of the partners of Pentagram in London who said, we're thinking of opening an office in New York and we want you to do a piece that will be a brochure or possibly a book on a really New York subject. And we came up, Alan Fletcher, the partner, and I came up with the idea of graffiti because graffiti, spray can had just been invented, and graffiti was all over the place. We're now winter 1972. The first day of the assignment, Pentagram sends an art director from London to work with me, come to my studio apartment to be a South African art director. And he said, well, how do we go about this book? And I said, well, I believe in plunging in. And I went into my pocket and took out a subway token. And I said, Mervyn, do you know what this is? He said, no. I said, well, that's a subway token. It's one for you, one for me. We're going to take the A train. We're going to go uptown and we'll find graffiti. This is December, between Christmas and New Year's, 72. So we go uptown, and I just had a hunch, not 125th Street. Took the A train. First stop after is 155th. I said, we'll get out here. And we didn't look like your typical New York residents. We didn't look like tourists. But on the platform...
right on the back cover. Is that the day? The 9 kids?
Yes.
Yeah.
On the platform were these children.
Yes. Yep. Sure enough, yeah.
And I'm wearing an LL, I have 2 cameras, a Leica M4, which I still have, and a Nikon FM2. Kolansky is a Keith Richards, or was a sort of Keith Richards look-alike, and he was wearing one of those 1960s, 70s reverse Afghan jackets. I had an L. Bean warden's thing or longer hair than I have today. This kid, and they're just hanging out. This kid comes up to me, looks at Mike, and I'm not threatened by, he's a 12-year-old. And it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, This kid comes up and says, nice cameras. What are you doing? So I always believe in telling the truth. It's so much easier. So I said, well, we're doing a book on graffiti. And they all start laughing. So I said, well, what's so funny about graffiti? And they said, well, we're graffiti writers.
Did they use the term writers, or did they call themselves artists? Because I know...
Never.
Touch on this.
This is very important.
Right.
Writers.
Touch on this.
I said to them, well, we're just starting. And I had no way of knowing. I said, why don't you get on the steps and I'll take your picture and maybe it'll get on the cover of the book. So they've all got their tags on these cards. And this is Butler and this is, and so on. So I take the picture and they very sweet. They said, well, we'll show you. They said, we're not masters. You see, there's a whole hierarchy of toys. These are toys, but the real masters, who are still writers, are called masters or kings. We'll show you. So for the next 10 days, mostly while Kolansky goes off to see his girlfriend. I mean, he did come out with me a couple of days, Kolansky, but...
Mailer thought...
well, let me just Mailer's not in the book at this point. So I take 100 rolls of Kodachrome over the next 10 days into New Year's, 73. Edit the 3,500 slides, Kodachromes. Take about a couple of hundred, maybe 10% to London, to Fletcher and his partners. And they selected about 65 for a book. Now, I had not done any books at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I allowed, which I would never do today, I allowed the art director to crop some of my photos, to, manipulate. He also, this is not the original. The green book up there is the original.
Oh, wow.
I can show it here. With the green cover was the original. In any event, so this is now February, March 73. In October, I get a phone call. I've, doing a lot of other work, didn't think much about it. Get a phone call from the Frankfurt Book Fair from a pretty well-known photographer, Life magazine photographer called Lawrence Larry Schiller, who we all knew because he had photographed Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, and Marilyn Monroe, and typical Life magazine. So he phones me, and in that era, a long-distance phone call was quite important. So Schiller, he said, "John, I love your photographs of graffiti. Superb, but nobody ever heard of Jon Naar. How would you feel about my bringing in a big-name author to write the introduction?" Mm-hmm. And I said, well, how about Susan Sontag, because she's just written a wonderful book or essay called On Photography. He said, no, I'm a friend of Norman Mailer. So I said, well, I happen to know Norman because I'm very involved in, as I was, in anti-Vietnam War draft planning and all that stuff. So I said, I'm quite comfortable with Mailer, but I don't think Pentagram be too happy because they conceive of a book with no text.
Oh, I see.
And they're very much, he said, well, I'll take care of that. So Schiller flies me from New York and the art director, Kurlansky, from London, I guess, to Los Angeles, where Schiller lived then, and spent 2 or 3 days twisting Pentagram's arm to accept Norman Mailer. I thought, it's a great idea. I said, well, Mailer's name on that green book, well, on this one too, gave me entree into every publishing house in New York.
Yeah.
So that opened the way for 11 other books. So Mailer and I didn't comment other than through my photography on graffiti because I didn't feel I had to. That's my statement. I think I caught the zeitgeist. I was interested in the context and the people. And Mailer, he goes overboard in calling them artists, and his name gave graffiti worldwide and approval that they couldn't have dreamed of. I mean, just, and the Green Book, and to some extent, they became, this is known as the Bible, you know. And whenever, for example, and so Norman was the one who called them artists.
Right.
They themselves never did, to their credit. I never did or would. A couple of them, who became friends of mine, did become artists, independent. Okay, that's fair enough. This guy became a New York City cop. And guess whose was his first arrest was of?
Graffiti writer.
This guy, Tony Cordero.